Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. But more importantly, welcome to the first live interview Education on Fire podcast. The main reason for doing this was that we have some fantastic conversations, but of course, normally they're all just pre-recorded. Whereas what this is actually going to be able to do is then going to be able to just sort of make sure that we have the option as a community to come together, and the main reason for that is so that you can leave your comments. We can do a little bit of Q&A as well as just me having the conversation with our fantastic guests. So that was the kind of the reason behind it, and also it gives me a little bit more time in terms of the time scale of what we want to do. There's been a little bit of a lag sometimes between the recording time and being able to get it out live, and when we've got some fantastic things we want to be able to get out into the world. If there's a time which is important for that, for example, like the challenge we're going to be talking about today, when there's a deadline in February, gives us a chance to kind of fit all those things and make sure we can get the most people who are going to be interested with the best opportunity to get involved. So we just want a couple of sort of housekeeping things. If you'd like to leave a comment, please do. It'd be fantastic to hear from you. Give me a thumbs up just to make sure that you can actually hear what's going on. You can see what's going on. If you want to ask a question, if you can write Q : before your question, then that way it'll be easy for me to search what's going on, and we'll kind of bring some of those questions towards the end. So a Q : before your question, and I'll try and make sure to search those out, and we'll get to those a little bit later on as we're going through. So what is it that we're actually going to be talking about today? Well, we're talking about the Big Education Challenge, and this is from bigchange.org. Now, we talk a lot here on the podcast about wishing it looked different, a magic wand to be able to kind of have the whole education system different. We know that's not always possible, but we know there are some great ideas out there and great conversations, and Big Change have this challenge here, which I think is a fantastic opportunity to, one, start the conversation, but also to have that to bring it through to some kind of fruition, which is going to be really amazing. So if you haven't already clicked subscribe, please do, because that way when we have more of these videos coming out, you'll already know about all of those things as well and keep everything up to date. But enough about all of that. Let's get going with our conversation. So I'm very pleased to welcome Caitlin Ross from Big Change, and we have Liz Robinson, who's the CEO from Big Education. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
So Caitlin, why don't you start us off with exactly what the challenge is, who's it for, and a bit of context.
Yeah, of course. Well, first off, thanks again for having me, and we're excited to share the challenge with you and with your audience. So thanks to everybody tuning in. So what is the Big Education Challenge? The Big Education Challenge is a £1 million prize fund that will support and reward bold ideas with the potential to transform education and learning. Not quite that magic wand that you were talking about, but hopefully as close as we can get. This will consist of two prizes. One is the Groundbreaker Prize, and this is for 18 to 25-year-olds with bold ideas with the potential to transform education and learning. And then the other prize is the Gamechanger Prize, which is for more experienced innovators with a track record of running projects or approaches with tangible social impact. The Big Education Challenge is run and designed by Big Change. We are a charity that was founded about 10 years ago to act as a catalyst to transform education and learning systems. Our vision, our purpose in doing all of this is to create a society where all young people are set up to thrive in life, not just in exams. And in the UK, we do this in two different ways. So we have the challenge, which I've just described, and we also run a big education conversation, which is meant to support inclusive conversations about the purpose of education and learning. And this challenge that we're running is actually we've been talking about it as an evolution and not a revolution in how we work, because we actually have 10 years of experience as a grant maker. We have backed over 40 innovative projects and ideas working at the front lines of change over the past 10 years, including, of course, Big Education. It was my privilege to work with Liz as an innovator with all the work that she's doing. But we've also backed some hopefully familiar names at a really early stage, including Voice 21, who we backed at their inception. They're now working in hundreds of schools across the UK to improve spoken language ability and oracy. We've backed The Difference, who are rethinking how we work in pupil referral units and rethinking inclusion practices. And we've also backed the likes of Frontline, who, when they were founded 10 years ago, were rethinking how social workers are trained to support young people, and they're now working with over 67,000 families across the UK. So we have some experience in backing these kinds of ideas, but we're really excited to try this new challenge methodology to source the best possible ideas from the grassroots, from young people, from teachers, from carers, from the people who have the lived experience of what is working and not working in education, and whose ideas should really be at the front of the kind of change that we need to create an education system that is fit for purpose.
And like I was saying before, I think this idea of the ability not just to talk about it, but to actually have the progress, like I say, the idea of actually what we're going to talk about could become something, you know, and I think the more people are involved, the more opportunities there are for not just this particular challenge and obviously the funding and to get this, like I say, this sort of seed to grow, but actually, you know, we don't know who's going to want to get involved. And as soon as people feel like, I think that snowball's starting to really move, then people will get more on, which is absolutely fantastic. And that's what we like, not just the conversations, but the ability to make a real difference.
Exactly.
So Liz, why don't, sorry, Karen.
Oh, no, I said exactly. I was just agreeing with you.
So Liz, why don't you take us into a little bit of your sort of day in the life currently and why this sort of is so important for you?
Sure, thank you, Mark. Great to be here. So first thing I should say is just to clarify, because we in Big Change are great friends and we both have big in our names and it can be quite confusing. So we are different organisations. We're not part of the same organisation. We are a multi-academy trust, so I'm responsible for our 3 schools, which are all in London, Surrey Square in Southwark and School 21 and School 360 in Stratford. And as well as running our schools, we run a number of different programmes and projects focused on a more expansive education. So why are we called Big as well? Well, because we believe that children and young people in this country need a big education, an expansive education, which encompasses what we sometimes talk about as head, heart and hand. So yes, of course, children and young people need a core of academic learning, but we all know and agree, and I think that's almost universally agreed, that they need a bunch of other things as well. And actually defining what those other things are that we need to teach is a big part of what we need to do as educators. We need to go back to think about what the purpose of school really is. Big Change, Caitlin there was talking about to thrive in life and not just exams. It's a great way of putting it. There are many different ways we can express that, but we've got to go back to really challenging ourselves around what the purpose of our school is, because at the moment it doesn't work really for anybody. It doesn't work for students. A third of students, of course, because of the way our exam system works, fail, inverted commas, at GCSE at the end of Key Stage 4 after 12 years of statutory schooling, because a third of students have to not get the grades, because that's how the system works. So we have a system with built-in failure, and we all know, broadly speaking, who those third of students are. They're broadly the most underserved and disadvantaged in our communities, which is just shocking. So it doesn't work for those children, but actually the students who do, inverted commas, achieve within the system actually are having a pretty reductive and often very stressful and pressurized experience. And then the irony being that employers then turn around to us as educators and say, well, hang on a minute, you're not actually giving us the skills that we want in our businesses and in our organisations. So quite who it works for, I don't know. And I have to say, as a parent of primary school age children myself, it definitely doesn't work for parents either, because it's like some sort of arms race through the system of inverted commas choice, to get your kids into certain schools, and it is a toxic situation. So that was my exposition of the problem. So at Big Education, what we're trying to do, running 3 state schools in challenging urban inner London contexts, is to actually put our money where our mouth is and try and do those things differently. So across our schools, there's a range of different practices, signature practices, which exemplify this idea of a big education. And we're trying to think about the most powerful, impactful ways to take some of those practices and some of those ideas out to influence other people, to be brave and make the difference that we believe is so important.
And I think for me, one of the big things is, I think a lot of people think like that. I think a lot of people wish that the schools that they're involved in were like that. But it takes a fearless leader, a fearless head that says, we know this is what children need. And what we need to do is to put it in place. And the things which you have to do, whether that's Ofsted, whether it's, exams, whatever the things happen to be, we know that if we've got a fantastic education, it will probably work all its way through that, and we'll still come out with an outstanding school and those things as well. But it's quite hard, I think, sometimes for those schools that feel like they're struggling or feel like they have to do things a certain way, just to kind of get going, that sort of swan idea of kind of the feet are going a million miles an hour, and they're just sort of trying to keep a sort of a happy face on the front. So, Liz, first of all, what do you think it is that those that feel like, yes, I'd like to have a school like an education system like you were describing, but feel like I'm not quite sure how I can put that into my current situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark, and it is easy to feel a bit powerless and a bit overwhelmed because there are complex structural barriers to us making some of the kind of changes that we believe in. So even in our own schools, where we are pushing the boundaries around many aspects, we still feel like we're in the foothills, really, when you look at innovative practice in a global context. Because of the kind of constraints, or even indeed when you look at the independent sector in England, there is so much more freedom. And that is absolutely fascinating about where the most privileged in society are as parents and students are going, which is away from GCSEs, away from formal qualifications, and into much richer, more diverse experiences. And that's happening at some of our top inverted commas, independent schools around the country. So it is very interesting. But the state system is, of course, has all those constraints. So what can people do? Well, look, we've been in the last 12 years under a government where we have not been aligned with the direction of travel. And so our approach hasn't been to sort of try and change policy or change Nick Gibbs' views on some of these big issues, because we just fundamentally disagree. So we've been inspired by the great Sir Tim Brighouse, who has this great expression about finding the gaps in the hedges. So in other words, finding the space where you can get on and do things. And the truth is, in English schools, we actually have one of the most devolved jurisdictions in the world. So in other words, head teachers like myself, I was a head teacher for many years, and trust leaders have a huge amount of freedom, in fact, about how we do things. There isn't a national curriculum that applies to multi-academy trusts. Some people think there should be, but multi-academy trusts do not have to follow the national curriculum. There's no legal requirement to teach pedagogies in a certain way. However, that huge freedom is coupled with some of the most extreme, high stakes, narrow accountability in the world. So we have this freedom, but then we have this incredibly high stakes accountability that goes with it. So as you say, that word fearless, I don't think any leader, I certainly would not class myself as fearless. I can be very fearful because that accountability is real, and it applies to me and our schools just as much as it does to anybody else. But it does take, I suppose, leaders who are prepared to feel the fear and do it anyway. I know it's a bit cheesy, but and that doesn't mean just kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. These are sophisticated, nuanced approaches. And what we really advocate within Big Education is a systemic view. You need to think about the school as a whole organisation and not just kind of randomly decide that, oh yeah, I fancy doing project-based learning because that sounds great, so let's just start doing that. You've got to be really interrogating, well, why do you think project-based learning is good? What are you trying to get out of it? What's the additionality? What's the additional learning? And you need rigour in the way that you innovate. So new things, innovative ideas done badly is just like anything else done badly. You know, it's not going to work. So we have a strong focus on kind of disciplined innovation and rigour, and doing things properly and thoroughly, and not just kind of running after things because they sound like a good idea or it's new and shiny. And so we want to have a go with it.
Yeah, and that is really important. And I think that's where these conversations are really interesting, because it puts the reality onto the kind of, like, say, the sort of the new shiny object syndrome of it could look like this and it could like that. And Caitlin, tell me, I know you don't have a crystal ball here, but do you have any sort of inkling of maybe what might come out of these initiatives through the challenge? Do you think there might be some kind of sort of whole-scale change? Is it just a small thing that might get developed? What's your sort of initial thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the most exciting things about doing this challenge and going really public with this kind of funding is I'm really excited to see what we're going to get. Like, I'm sure I'm going to see some things that I've never seen before. But one of the things that we really feel strongly about is that the kind of ideas that we would want to support with this challenge have transformational potential. And what that means for us, like, first and foremost, is these ideas are going to be challenging what the purpose of different areas of education and learning are, and really picking them up and examining them and seeing, okay, is the purpose of the different areas of education and learning that I'm working in, sort of like, is that really fit for purpose? Is that setting young people up to thrive in life and in society? And so traditionally, and also with this challenge, we've been sort of, agnostic within the areas of education that we've supported. We've supported things across all age groups, from even in areas that are sort of education adjacent, from social work to youth offending. So we're really excited to see how these different innovators, honestly, especially the young people, seeing sort of the different ways in which they're really challenging the assumptions about what the purpose of the area of education and learning that they're trying to change is. And I'm so excited to learn just as much from these innovators as hopefully they will from us along the process.
And I think for me, listening to young people is incredibly important. But I think also, Liz, what you said before, that sense of there isn't anybody that's involved in any part of this that feels like they're getting what they need. We certainly know it's not right for children, the increase in mental health issues and their overall well-being. And, we're currently in a situation where teachers are obviously thinking about striking. And I sort of think about the situation with children is that their main objective is to grow and to thrive. And we often talk here on the podcast about, allowing toddlers, especially when they're learning to walk, they just fail all the time. They get up, they fall over, they take one step, and bit by bit they find their way. And what we do is we create an environment for them to be safe as the adults, as the people that can kind of put all those things in place, but allow that growing. And we sort of hit school, and then all of a sudden it suddenly becomes a little bit too structured, some people would say. But then within that, like you say, you have employers saying we don't have the skills coming out of school because this isn't what we need. It's not about the exams. We want about the skills and the ability to have a conversation. It's certainly things you mentioned, primary school children. We've got teenage children here. And that ability, can you make a phone call and just speak to somebody? Oh, no, it's all online. It can only be text. And there are so many different types of skills which are just sort of being lost as time goes on. It'd be interesting if there was ever any point where there's a sort of a round table where we have sort of children, educators, leaders, people from industry actually just having almost like a chart where everyone can put down what they want to see and where those things kind of cross over, and actually have that as a starting point of kind of these are the sort of things that we want to do. So from your point of view, Liz, what's the starting point from you? Like, say there are certain curriculum things that you'll have to do, certain things that you want to do, but are we really talking about what it is that children need at a fundamental level in terms of getting that excitement going, that feeling safe, the sense of failure? I mean, how does that sort of work within big education, and how do you sort of foster that?
Yeah, great question. And I love your, the sort of metaphorical or literal sense of, young people and policymakers being round a table, virtual or otherwise. And actually, that's I think what an organisation that I think is doing such interesting work in that space is called States of Mind. And I've been working with them. They're actually applying to the fund, so you never know. You may hear more about them. And who run participatory action learning with students. So they empower students as researchers, and have done a fantastic piece of work called Breaking the Silence, which was a 4-year research project that the students ran the research project themselves, really asking all these questions. And what ended up happening was that they redesigned the Ofsted framework, and they talked to Ofsted in loads of Ofsted inspectors. There's a fantastic film about it. Which is, if you really listen to what students say, they will say all of this, right? So I suppose in some senses, the arguments of the problem statement, I would say, is actually pretty universally understood, I would say, by 90% of people in this country, be them parents, employers, students themselves. Unfortunately, probably some of the 10% who don't agree with that are in the Department of Education, which is a bit of a downside. But I think that is true. I think they're very, very unrepresentative of views across the country. So I think the problem statement is kind of agreed. So, what did we do about that? So I guess a couple of things to say, and I'll be brief. We've spent a lot of time investing in leadership, and that's one of the things that Big Change supported us with, was developing a leadership program, which is called the Big Leadership Adventure. There's our little plug for that, which is a 2-year development program for leaders who want to be change makers in the system. And that's important because, as you say, leaders create the context, they create the environment and the psychological safety for the teachers and the staff, and therefore the students in the school, to do something differently, to be able to take risks, inverted commas, to be able to work in slightly different ways. In other words, ways that don't simply optimize for exam success. Okay, so what we're talking about here is making some trade-offs where we're putting some additional time, resource, and focus into activities that are not directly linked to exam success. So that may mean taking some curriculum time away from a GCSE subject and spending some of that time doing something different. So what that looks like, as an example, in our schools, in School 21, we run a program called Real World Learning in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. So in the place of a 9th GCSE, students do 8 GCSEs. Most students in the country do 9 because of the way that EBAC and buckets and Progress 8 buckets, you want to have options, but we do 8 and we stick with 8. And in the place of a 9th, students actually go out on placement on a weekly basis and work in an employment situation, solving a real world problem with an employer, be that a business or a charity or whatever, an area, as much as we can do it, that's of particular interest to them. So that's a trade-off, because we could be spending that time, resource, and all the effort that goes into making that program work on extra booster lessons for their GCSEs. Okay, so that's an example of a real world trade-off. Now that takes courage from the leaders. Ultimately, me, I'm the person responsible to the DFE and the head teacher to make that call and make that decision. We are going to spend that resource, be it time or financial resources, in a different way. And you've got to be clear then, well, what are the outcomes we're trying to get out of that? How is that better and different to doing another GCSE? It's got to be good, right? And we've got to have ways of then evidencing the impact of that and empowering young people to be able to articulate the additional skills and experiences as part of their ongoing journey, which is another thing that Big Change have been partnering with on, which is around assessment, which is a whole nother kind of topic around how do we help have more meaningful ways of evidencing the range of skills, dispositions, aptitudes, experiences that is what a full and rich education should be, and that isn't simply a matter of a couple of numbers and letters against your name when you leave school.
And that's a really interesting thing to talk about, I guess, from a student point of view, because most of them will say, I'm just after 9s and 8s, and that's what I'm about. And then I've had many conversations with our kids about what that looks like. Does that look like about studying all day, every day? And it may still not be the case. Is it about having a balanced life? Is it about structuring in your way? Is it about focusing on certain things? Is it about understanding what you really love? Is there any reason why all of those 8 or 9 subjects should actually be the thing you want to spend all your time doing? Absolutely, we need a broad curriculum. We need a chance to experience things. But we all know, if we just take our own lives, we experience loads of things and we think, but I really enjoy gardening, football, sewing, whatever it happens to be, and that's when you then put your time in. We have a basic level of things that we want to do. So that's a really sort of interesting point. And Caitlin, I'm interested from sort of a charity point of view. You must hear lots of these types of conversations from different people at different levels of organisations and that sort of thing. What's your sort of feeling about all of that, sort of partly in relation to what Liz said, but in terms of where you think that change maybe be able to come in?
That's a really good question. And I just to say, like, everything that Liz has been talking about just sort of illustrates the point that, like, teachers, school leaders, sort of like those at the front lines of education need to be at the front line of this change that we need to education so it's fit for purpose. So thanks for your continued great work. It's a pleasure to work with you. As you were speaking about sort of focusing on grades, possibly at the detriment to passion and sort of like finding your purpose. Just today, I was speaking to one of our Big Education Challenge champions, who are folks that we've engaged to help us get the word out. A young man called Jaden Corfield, who is a co-founder of Rekindle School, which is a supplementary school up in Manchester, and also Outliers, which is an organization trying to foster positive masculinity in young men in Salford, where he's from. And I think his exact words, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, was sort of like, education system as it is now, like, squashes passion before it even gets to set in. And that's his experience of the education system was that it just like really limits your belief. And that's just tragic. That's not okay. That's the opposite of what education is supposed to do. That's the opposite of what teachers get into this profession to do. So we hear it from all across the system. One organization that we funded, which is called Heads Up for Head Teachers, which is a network of head teachers and coaching and support for head teachers who are in a position where they don't feel like they're in a position where they can do the job that they signed up to do. They are subjected to this toxic accountability that we've alluded to throughout this conversation, and they're working with hundreds of head teachers who appear to be sort of quietly suffering across the country. And we have so many people who have so much passion and so much potential and really wants to foster the next generation so that they're set up to thrive and take care of society, because it'll be their turn next. And it's just no one wants education to be like this. And so what's this change? One of the things that we talk about a big change is sort of like education being everybody's business, alluding to your former point of sort of like there needing to be like a coalition of businesses and young people and teachers talking about what they want that change to be. And we think that this change has to come from across the system. Like there is no silver bullet. There is no one group within education that can fix it all. It needs to be a collaborative effort. It needs everyone who is affected by education, which is everyone, to get stuck in. And we're really excited to welcome bold ideas from across the system. One of the things that we were really intentional about is with our Gamechanger Prize, making sure that it's open to social innovators who might have an idea for education, but might not necessarily have a background in education, because education is everyone's business. Everyone has some sort of lived experience of it. So we're really welcoming bold ideas from across the system, because this in order to make the changes to education that need to happen to set all young people up to thrive, we need a cross system effort.
And that's real music to my ears, because that's really where this podcast started. I was doing music workshops across the country, and I was seeing teachers who were so enthusiastic, really feeling like they were banging their heads against a brick wall. They'd obviously got in to make a difference, and we've talked about what great schools and great leaders can do, but we also know that's not the case across every single school. And I was seeing quite a lot of people just thinking, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't really what I want to be doing, but I don't know how to do anything about it. And so I was just wanting to sort of join those dots. It really was that, well, I know you don't know this as a teacher, but down the road I've been in a school and they're doing it like X, or in Scotland they're doing this, or someone in America's doing this. It doesn't matter about the curriculum or the setup, because the principles of what they're doing and how they're doing it are actually happening now. And sometimes that's just a small thing you can bring in and you can implement it straight away. Or even if you will have to maybe take it to your senior leadership, at least you can say, this is happening somewhere. Can we at least have a conversation or get it going? And then hopefully that change can happen in your own environment. But even if it's not, at least you can feel supported that I think what you believed in to begin with actually is something that you've got a community of people who also believe. And I think when you feel like you're on a sort of the crest of a wave with people who are in your corner and feeling the same way, you are making a difference, even if maybe your immediate situation doesn't necessarily feel like that. And I'm sure, Liz, you've sort of come across those things yourself.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing to say is that staff who work in our schools wouldn't say it's not all kind of sunshine and roses either. We believe in a big education, and we exist in an imperfect system, and it's really blooming hard. And we do. And I was a head teacher for many years, 13 years at Surrey Square, and we used to say that to staff, which is like, it's hard, and we try and put people off from coming to work at the school because in terms of really testing their resolve, because it is hard to because we're looking at a number of different a number of different pedagogies when we really get down to it, because we're asking people to be kind of coaches and work on relationships and restorative justice, restorative practice. We have a values-based curriculum, so we're asking people to invest in relationships with students and reflective conversations, which is different and more vested than a kind of top-down discipline policy which says these are the rules, do it, or this is the consequence. Cognitively, it's much more complex. Emotionally, it's much more complex and demanding. It's much, much more rewarding, and it is demanding, right? Because it's not as simple as saying, right, if a child throws a pencil, that is the consequence. They get this, that's going to happen, and these kind of zero tolerance approaches, right? Cognitively, that's simpler. And as a teacher, so it's easy to idealize. I'm not trying to make it seem undoable, but it's just recognizing that it is more complex. And so, asking people to adopt project-based learning as a pedagogy, which we do have in all of our schools, or interdisciplinary or kind of real world focused learning, it's more complex because you can't just use a plan from a pre-planned scheme, because it's got to be real. So it's got to be responsive to, well, what's the real problem we're working on? How do we co-design that? How do we co-produce that with the students? Now, that is a skill set that not all teachers have, and it's a skill set that, frankly, is fairly scarce given the last kind of 12 years of what pedagogy and input has looked like. And it's hard, right? It's a more complex pedagogy to get really good at, of kind of running workshops and facilitating that and having more student autonomy. Like, that's easy to do badly, right? That's easy to do badly and hard to do well. Whereas if, direct instruction, follow maths mastery, and I'm not criticizing maths mastery, we use maths mastery, we adapt it, that is, it's much easier to get that right? And we've got 24,000 schools and however many 1,000 teachers, it's hard. And without infrastructure and support to help teachers do this really well, we have seen that in our schools. People come, they believe they want to do it, and if we haven't got the right infrastructure and support there to help them get good at all that, that range of pedagogies, it's demanding on people. So anyway, that was a bit negative. I didn't mean to sound negative. I just think it's reflective of why it's so challenging, right? It's partly because it's conceptually more complex to work in this way, as opposed to the prize is good results. I get good results by doing all my, testing, screening, who are my marginal kids. We know how to catch them up. We know how to do exam prep. It's okay. That's my job. I get it. So we're asking. I suppose that's the quid pro quo for teachers. The passion is that we want it to be more holistic, and it's recognizing that it takes a sophistication of approach, which we've got to recognize as a profession we need to engage in and support people with the really rigorous training approaches in those alternative pedagogies.
And I'm assuming as time goes on, that gets harder, or you are going literally back to basics, because you're going to have staff that have never worked in those conditions. You're going to have staff who were maybe not out of education themselves very long, who have only experienced it as pupils as well. So while they might like it to have been different, their own experience is that this is how it works, this is how it goes. I've now trained, and now I'm sort of facilitating that same kind of thing. And so,
we've got leaders, who have come through that and have come through, multi-academy trusts, for example, where it's quite straightforward. Like, it's all about the scores on the doors, and this is how we do it. And we have these fairly kind of rigid approaches to management, and and people have built a lot of success in the system. So there's a lot of vested interest in the status quo, because a lot of professionals have built their reputation and their status through being very good at optimizing for exam success and kind of accepting that. So, not everybody in the system, even though on one level they might say they want change, there are a lot of people vested in the status quo.
And that really just, like I say, tells you how complex it is. But I think in some ways it gives me a little bit of comfort, in as much as you can't fix it, you can't make it different for everybody. So you then have to do what you can. And that is, like I say, signing up so that you want to take part in the challenge. You want to get your voice out there. You want to get your ideas out there. It goes back to, what's the one thing I can do today? And so often here we hear people saying, teachers that they remember is always about how it made them feel. It was never about how they were taught maths or English or science or even a subject that they really liked, although that often brought themselves out. It's the fact that they knew they were having a tough time. They were able to have a conversation. They remembered there was an important day happening over the weekends, and it became, a human to human, albeit respectful with everything that it needs to be within a school system. But actually, I see you, you see me. Oh, right, okay, now we're working with each other, and that sort of transcends traditional education in terms of what people start seeing in terms of, we're now learning certain subjects in a certain way. But I think there's always something you can do, like you're saying. If you can't fix it all, but you can have that conversation, you can have that relationship, in which way, and you can have that within your school community, but also outside of your school community as well, which is really important.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, if you want to ask a comment or anything, please do just put it in the comments here, and we'll get to your Q&A as well. So that'll be fantastic as well. Sorry, I just interrupted you.
No, I interrupted you, Mark. It's your podcast. Yeah, I know. I think the point is there are lots of things you can do, and at the end of the day, as a teacher, you close the door and you get on with your job, and you have thousands of decision points and choice points in any given day. One of the amazing things about teaching is that it's ultimately a dynamic profession, because it is happening live. You can't just kind of think, oh, I'll close my laptop for 5 minutes and go and have a, like people who work in more different, it's live. And how the students respond to you, how you respond, the state you're in, how well prepared you are, etc. Are these micro factors in how a lesson pans out and all the rest of it. I mean, it's incredibly fascinating when you think about it. And we have these opportunities as teachers to make different decisions. So, as you say, relationship building is such a powerful one. And actually, as teachers, you can tweak things. You can try a different thing. And sometimes something like oracy that Caitlin mentioned in the fantastic work of Voice 21, which is part of Big Education and grew out of Big Education, is that it's that you can make big changes, but you can also make some relatively small changes in your classroom that make a very big difference. So the difference of simply breaking up your teacher input with saying, right, turn and talk to the person next to you, have a discussion, I'm going to be doing whatever to ask you to feed back, is nobody's going to sort of stop you from a top-down point of view. You can get on and implement some of those changes in your classroom. So that is the power of connection and learning from others, as you say. And there are thousands of those kind of tweaks that can build up over time to being something more significant. But I don't want the message to be there's nothing you can do, because actually, as teachers, once the door's shut, you've got a lot of autonomy to get on with things in the way that you think is going to work best for your students.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And Caitlin, is someone who's working with a charity that is making a difference, that is making a change, how do you sort of perceive that from your school education experience into your now sort of work life, and that ability for you personally as sort of making that difference sort of within the role that you're doing? I'm sort of interested how that sort of correlation works for you.
Yeah, of course. And I think before I answer that question, I think I wanted to just reflect on something I was thinking about as Liz was speaking, which is that, as much as we can know, like I do not have a background as an educator, but we have, from learning from the folks that we funded before, a decent understanding that doing things differently, especially in education, is really hard. It's really hard. And so one of the purposes we see of our funding, and especially through the challenge, is giving innovators that time and space and resource to try things differently, to get that evidence base, to show that a new way is possible, so that others can see that a new way is possible. And hopefully this becomes, a grassroots movement. And that's also part of the reason that we designed the challenge specifically to be in 2 different phases. So our first phase will be to pick 15 finalists who will get small grants and a tailored package of capacity building supports to just do some really intense testing of and some really early testing of their idea for 6 months. At which point we pick 6 winners to win a grand prize, a grand cash prize, to fully pilot their ideas. So all of the way that we have funded to date, and the way that we have designed this challenge, which has been co-designed with our youth advisory group, with folks that we funded before, has been in response to the challenges of doing things differently and how important that time, space, and resource is. So that is that. But your question was about me. Well, you might clock from my accent, I did not go through the British education system. And to be honest, I had such bad test anxiety when I was younger. I don't know what I would have done if I'd been rigorously tested, had to do a rigorous standardized test at 16 and then again at 18. I had a friend growing up who was going through the British education system, and I was really taken aback by how she had to narrow her education down so quickly. And that was really shocking to me. And I'm not, of course, the American education system has its own challenges, but it made being in the position that I'm in now, which is kind of like lifting up the hood of the British education system and seeing what works and what doesn't, really makes me kind of grateful for the education that I had, which was more time and more opportunity to kind of keep things quite broad. I did a liberal arts degree, which meant that I had a focus on international relations, but I was also taking science classes, language classes. While I wanted to go out and do international development, I took a geology class where we went and hung out at the San Andreas Fault and learned how earthquakes worked. And I'm really, I enjoyed it at the time, but doing the work that I do now makes me really grateful that I didn't have to make such tough decisions so early that could have, limited my options, or created an environment where I was telling myself some, like, pretty limited stories about my own potential. And in education in general, I come at this from a belief and a desire to, work towards social justice in my work. You may have seen from my CV, I've tried this in a few different ways. I've done international development, classic aid work, economic development, gender equity stuff. And through all of my work, what became so clear is that if you're interested in equity, if you're interested in social justice in the future, education is a huge lever and so important to get right if we are going to create a society that's going to look after its citizens best, and to equip the next generation to thrive and be the people they want to be.
I love that, and it always just sort of warms my heart, really, that we can see headlines, we can hear there's a challenge, and we know people are making a difference. But the thing I love about the podcast is that you start to hear that passion, that understanding, and the journey that everyone has to make that difference. It's individual to everybody, but there's that common thread, I think, of that, yes, this is the reason why this can happen, is because there's a group of people, whether it's at Big Change, whether it's at Big Education, wherever it happens to be, that are doing it in their way based on their experiences, their understanding. And that kind of, it has to look a certain way. It's never going to work because there's 7 or 8 billion people in the planet. It's always going to be different in a different way. And I think being able to share the ideas, but then, like you say, mold them, make them work in a way that's going to work for you and your particular situation is really, really important. And tomorrow, for example, the podcast that's going to go live, I was talking to Julia Lynch, and she's in charge of the Global Girl Project. And so if you listen to that, we're not talking about going to school. We're talking about leadership. We're talking about people in the global south who have a completely different world, a completely different human situation from an education point of view and a life point of view. Still education, it's still making a difference, but it has to be starting from a different place than, like, say, how we're going to be teaching maths or English or science or any kind of general thing. But it's still, when it starts at that kind of human level and meeting people where they are with their situation, then all of a sudden it can make a really big difference. Mm-hmm. So we have a question that's coming. So let's have a look. So this comes from Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew. Do you think COVID grade inflation showed that teachers are in fact seeing something more in their students than the exams can measure? And how can we value more of that talent that the exams are actually missing? So Liz, why don't you start us off on that?
Great question. I mean, where do we start? I mean, the way that we assess students in COVID was different, wasn't it? It was not a test. It was based on typicality and a range of information, so that we could create our best fit grade, right? Which is more how certainly GCSEs used to be before the Gove reforms, which was a combination of different types of ways of assessing, right? So it was wrong to compare them like for like, in my view, because it was a different sort of assessment to the way the tests are. And the point that I made sort of in my initial rant about GCSEs is, we have this norm reference system whereby it doesn't matter how well a particular cohort do. If they just do much better than the previous year, the same number of students are going to get the same number, the grades, even if a student the following year scored the same as, somebody who got a 9 the previous year. If there's more of them scoring at that level, they're not all going to get a 9. It's unlike the US system, of which there are many faults and criticisms, but everybody in principle can graduate high school. It's a universal kind of qualification to get a high school graduation certificate, but that's not true of our exam system. So the whole thing is kind of in an algorithm which is stuck to not enable all students to be successful. And what we saw in the CAGs and during COVID was students being assessed in a more holistic way, and in a more accurate way. And I think, it's interesting when you look at Key Stage 2 and SATs, and when writing has moved to be teacher assessed rather than the tests, and the quality of writing in primary schools has improved so markedly, moving away from those reductive, ridiculous tests when students had to, perform and write a particular style, and they were taught in this ridiculously formulaic way of how to write different genres. So, teachers are capable, and of course, we have other parts of our system, including early years and Key Stage 1, which are teacher assessed, and there are very sophisticated approaches to moderation, which exist. So it's kind of, we do have places in the system where this works. And indeed, if we look at one of my great friends just handed in his PhD thesis, at the top end, when we're making people into doctorates and PhDs, we have a Viva, we have a different way of assessing. So this sort of obsession with exams, it is part of the Govian 2010 reforms that exams are the fairest, best way. That's not true. You can't. That's the argument you get back, is that you get unconscious bias, and teachers can't be fair and can't be equitable. Of course they can. You look at all sorts of systems like music exams, for example. If you go and do your grade 5 piano, it is assessed by an expert teacher. And we don't say, oh, I don't think you really got a distinction because the teacher was biased. We accept those things as being quite credible and quite serious. So there are lots of examples where we do assess pupils in different ways. One of our big projects around rethinking assessment and assessment reform, if anyone's interested, do go and have a look at that, rethinkingassessment.com. We've got a whole range of different projects going on at the moment, looking about how, firstly, you have to know what you want to assess, and you have to articulate those broader range of skills and dispositions that you want to assess. And of course, there are different ways of assessing them. And there are even in this current system, things like drama. Of course, they have to be an element of teacher assessment, because you just can't fit everything into a neat box. And it's an example of the metrics. The desire for simple numeric metrics has become so obsessive, and targets around that we have a bit of a cliche, but we do seriously have the tail wagging the dog of the system, of this kind of maniacal focus on wanting numbers in boxes that somehow tell us something about quality, and it is reduced to an absolute absurd extent.
And Caitlin, what are your thoughts? And my first thought is that kind of, I can't remember who told me now, but they were saying, we're going back to this sort of employer idea that, in some ways, exams become irrelevant because, yes, they are what they are and you've taken them what they are, but because these days you can actually see everyone's actual CV through social media, through their interactions, some kind of version of LinkedIn, which kind of has people endorsing all the sorts of things that you do. I mean, Caitlin, you work with an organisation. I'm sure you get to see people who want to be involved and work with you. I'm sure the first thing you don't look at is necessarily just the exam results, because we know there's more to it than that.
Yeah, of course. And one of the things that I'm really looking forward to, like, learning more about the challenge is different ideas, and sort of like what are the best ways that we can make sure that young people come out of education being able to put their best foot forward, being able to show all of their different talents, all of their different achievements beyond their test scores. As I'm not an educator, I've never had to grade an exam. I don't necessarily. Liz is definitely more of an authority to speak to how that works, how that could work than I am. But it's just what's clear from what we're hearing from young people, from what we're hearing from teachers, what we're hearing from parents, is that the current system just is really limiting and isn't setting young people up to put their best foot forward. And as an employer, sort of, obviously, I haven't. I mean, to be honest, I didn't really, when I first started looking at CVs, when I started hiring people in the UK, I didn't know people put their GCSE grades in, and I didn't know what they meant. But like just being someone who didn't come through this system, I was like, I don't know what an A-star means. That sounds good, but like what I'm interested in is, what are you passionate about? Sort of like what are the capabilities? What are the mindsets that you bring to a job? Because that's going to tell me so much more about someone's capability, someone's potential than a number.
Yeah. And I really think that's something for everyone to bear in mind, isn't it? If you're a student, a pupil going through, make sure that comes across in any communications that you have, and as an employer and people in the education system, just making people understand that. Just be authentically you in whatever format or way you interact with somebody. That authenticity is the thing that will shine through, which isn't to say you're not going to work hard and try and do the best you can, because you have to take exams and that kind of thing. But I think seeing that bigger picture is obviously the most important thing. And I just wanted to come back, Liz, you mentioned Sir Tim Brighouse earlier, and the primary sector. The National Association for Primary Education have got their Primary Education Summit in March. So if you're involved in primary education anywhere, please do check that out. That's at nape.org.uk/summit, and that's involved. There's a free Christian Schiller lecture given by Dr. Neil Hawkes. There's 11 pre-recorded presentations and also 4 live discussions, which is humanities, primary assessment, the environment, and early years foundation stage as well. So that's going to be fantastic. So that's it, nape.org.uk/summit. So thank you both for being so enthusiastic and passionate about this, which I knew was going to be the case. Caitlin, just finish us off with the final details that people really need to make sure they know in terms of dates, websites, and that kind of thing.
Great. Well, you've still got a few weeks to submit if you're hearing about the challenge for the first time. And I'd start by just encouraging anyone who thinks they have a kernel of an idea, even if you've never tried it before, if you've never gotten funding, it doesn't matter. That's what this challenge is for. We specialize in the early stage, the kernels of an idea that have transformational potential. So if you never tried it before, doesn't matter. We still really want to hear from you. And you have until February 22nd to share your ideas with us. We will be selecting and announcing finalists in May. And then after the 6 months of testing and capacity building supports, we'll be sharing who our winners are in the late autumn of 2023. And I really can't wait to read all of the ideas that we get and hear from all of the potential innovators out there.
Fantastic. Liz, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. Caitlin, thank you much for sharing about the challenge. And I really hope lots of people get involved and we get some great kernels of those sort of starting points to make a big difference completely across the board.
Thank you.
Everyone who's been here on the podcast live, thank you so much. I really appreciate you watching, and thank you, Andy, for your comments. Really appreciate that. If you're listening on the audio podcast afterwards, I hope you've enjoyed this new kind of little format, and also we'll do some more of these, so you have the opportunity to get involved and comment on some new ones coming through. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this is the start of some amazing opportunities and some amazing ideas that the challenge can take forward. So thanks so much, and we'll speak to you again very, very soon. It's not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.